Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this live session. I'm delighted to be again with Shoaib. How you doing, bro?
Assalamualaikum Savor. Thank you for inviting me. Alhamdulillah. I'm doing okay. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. You're always ready for, anything I throw at you. So I just messaged you a few days ago. I said I want to do something on the Divine Action Project, and you said let's go because you're, involved in these discussions quite regularly. Sorry, I just smudged my
No
thing.
worries.
There you go. Fixed now. So what have you been up to? People haven't seen you in a while, and on Facebook, you keep people updated.
I think it depends on which part of the world you ask. So I was in the I was in the US for about a month. Actually, most of November I was there. So I was doing a tour of talks on Islam, science, and atheism. So it was a beautiful trip. MashaAllah, I got to meet so many different communities, different masajids, different imams. Very very interesting young group of imams that are like emerging out of the US context. So that was very interesting to see, MashaAllah. And yeah, it was just lovely to kind of see different people. One thing I've learned though is that the US is the only country that I've experienced in which you can still fly through four time zones and still be in the same country. And then also the infrastructure, the way the urban designs are laid out vary from one to another.
Mm.
And it was interesting to me because I've never experienced this, but I was in Arizona, and there's this open gun culture. So people are carrying guns in plastic bags, right? So I'm like, oh, okay. So that was the new part for me. But it was very, very good. Alhamdulillah. I got to meet just amazing people on the ground, got to see some Islamic schools, the Islamic infrastructure there. So it was very enlightening. And then it ended with me going to the AAR. So for those people who don't know, so the AAR is the American Academy of Religion, and they have an annual conference every year in November. So this year was in San Antonio, in Texas. And it's like we get like 10, 15,000 academics in one place from all over the world, right? And so it was a brilliant. I got to meet so many people in Islamic studies, professors from science or religion, and it just was a wonderful way to kind of end the whole thing. Then came back to the UAE, and now moving houses. So I converted my parents' shed into an office. So yeah, things have been all over the place. Hence the beard length. I haven't had time to trim my beard or anything. So I look disheveled because of that.
It's good to see you in action, mashallah, in America. There's a lot of people that aren't exposed to the sort of discussions that you have on this side of the pond, and I think a lot of people actually they need this right now, especially because we're seeing, in the States, a large percentage of the population, the Muslim population, are actually educated compared to other parts like UK and stuff. And these sort of questions are, very important. People don't understand how important these questions are for the youth, especially. Assalamu alaikum, Jamie, mashallah, another one of the brothers I had on the live some time back. So Jamie Turner, he's just left us a comment there. So inshallah, we're going to be starting the session.
Yeah. Before we do support,
Yes.
I just thought I should add that just a few weeks before I went to the US, there was a report that came out by an ex-Muslim of North America, right? It's like the ex-Muslim Council of Britain, I think. And they published a report, and this corroborated what I know from other studies as well, that in the US, 1 in every 4 Muslims is leaving Islam.
Wow.
Yeah. So this was very interesting. That's why there was a big need. And so I asked the local imams there, like, based on your surroundings, how many people are coming to the mosque, how many people like that. And so that was a big one. So that was very interesting. So I think there's a real need for addressing concerns like, atheism, Islam and science. So in that report, believe it or not, 93%. So it was a report by ex-Muslims, right? And it was studying ex-Muslims, and it says 93% of all the people they interviewed, one of the main reasons for leaving was Islam and science. 93% said that was a reason for them, either a primary or a secondary one. So there's a real need for this kind of stuff there. Real need everywhere, I think, but I think this is a big issue there.
There is, there's been people. There have been people who have been pretty, strong in their atheism. After leaving Islam, and they've come back to Islam after being exposed to your works. These are things that we know of, right? So the thing is, there is a huge gap in the market. People are leaving because of ignorance, and a lot of the times, that discussion that me and you had on the podcast, where you had those particular ideas about you can't be a scientist and a practicing Muslim, and all these misconceptions you had while living in a Muslim country. Imagine living in a non-Muslim country. So in a way, we can see what the solution is, and we can see it's a huge problem. And the sad thing is, I believe, not enough Muslims know about the importance of these things, and they don't really react until it's too late. So we need to, obviously educate our youth on these issues. So another thing that happened between now and the last time that I had you on my podcast was you got a promotion to, be an editor of something quite prestigious. So maybe you can explain.
I was wondering where are you going with this? Okay, yeah. So yeah, I can make this announcement. So alhamdulillah, I've been working. So my research is mostly to do with Islam and science. I teach, aqid. I teach, how to address thoughts in atheism. In fact, literally just before this, I just finished the last class for Islam and atheism with Low Tree Foundation in London. And so yeah, in the field of Islam and science, there is no proper infrastructure, right? Science religion does have dedicated departments. It has even its own book series. And what I mean here, largely Christian-centric discussions, right? Christian developments. But there's nothing equivalent like that in the Muslim space. So alhamdulillah, after a very long 6-month process, I pitched to Palgrave that can we have a series on Islam and science? They really love this idea. And alhamdulillah, just 2 months ago, we officially established the world's first academic monograph series for Islam and science. What this means is that we now have an academic outlet in which people can submit book ideas, professors around the world, and we already have proposals coming in. We've already contracted one on organ transplantation. We have one on AI and theology. We have one on Allama Iqbal and evolution, for example, right? And so many more coming in. We already have one on how to teach biosciences in light of Islamic theology, so AI, exotheology, all these kinds of things. So and I'm the chief editor of this operation. So they've hired me as a chief editor. So inshallah, in the next 10, 20 years, imagine now we have an academic outlet that we can use for Muslims worldwide. All the topics pertaining to Islam and science: historical, philosophical, theological, sociological. So that's one thing that's happened. That's what you know, but I don't think you know the other thing that's also happened. I am also, and this was very recent, I am also the chief editor of the world's first encyclopedia, academic encyclopedia on Islam and science, also by Palgrave. And I have a team of 6 working with me. So these include Nazim Muhtaraglu, David Solomon Jalajal, Abdullah Uthman, who was the principal of Cambridge Muslim College, Amina Inlows, Laura Hassan, and Mansoor Ali. So we have now these 2 massive projects that can significantly catalyze and accelerate the field of Islam and science. And it's my intention, inshallah, that I got this while I was very young. I just turned 35. So I think that this will hopefully become an important milestone for Islamic scholarship, but also in terms of public outreach for a lot of these conversations. So keep us in your du'as for everyone who's watching. I just hope that this becomes a khidmah to the ummah, inshallah, some kind of service.
Definitely. And one of the things I was thinking about is that sometimes you need someone to raise a flag so people can see it and come towards the direction. We have fantastic academics in various parts of the Muslim world. Sometimes they're working in complete silos. They are not able to actually even get their foot in the door when it comes to Western academia, because they happen to be in parts of the Muslim world where they have degrees from universities that maybe are not even recognized in the West. And you need an outlet that so many different Muslims who have things to contribute, they can actually come forward, and we can speak about very important topics. I mean, there's lots of really interesting things when it comes to determinism, chaos theory, that we have a lot of areas, AI, that AI in Islam. Obviously, things that we're discussing, evolution, laws of nature. There's lots of
E-word, Sabur. You said the E-word on YouTube.
Yeah, I just think it's going to be a matter of time, just maybe a decade or so, in which we're going to have, inshallah, a large number of Muslim academics that can contribute. Because, at the end of the day, we want to leave behind a legacy, inshallah. We want to leave behind something that people can look at and they can be proud of. They can be, okay, so what's Islam's solution to this? How do we deal with this particular thing? I would really, really love to see something on, laws of nature, and something related to, the special action project, and different schools of thought. This is a very interesting area. It's a very interesting area. We had ulama in the past speaking about, occasionalism and these types of topics, and now we can actually publish and we actually talk about these at a deep level. So let's get into it. Firstly,
on that point, I'll share one story with you that I think that will hopefully inspire the people watching this as well. So 7 years ago, I spoke for the ISB, the Islamic Society of Britain. This is, I think, prior to COVID, right? And I delivered the contingency argument, right, to make it easy. So they said, can you deliver this to 200 students? Like, okay, why not? And we had students from around the world. It wasn't just the UK. And there was one student in there. I'm not going to mention his name because of the reason I'll say shortly. But that one student just finished his master's degree back then, 7 years ago. That individual attended that class, got in touch with me saying, like, I'm going to work on Allama Iqbal for my PhD. I'm like, great. And he said, I'm going to look at his laws of nature and all of that. Okay? That person just finished his PhD. And today, alhamdulillah, just today, this is 7 years, remember, 7 years passed. Just today, we got the word that Palgrave will accept his thesis as a book for that series.
Allah.
This is just a student. So, you're talking about, bringing a cohort. Alhamdulillah, I am seeing it in front of me. And hopefully, inshallah, we have more and more people contributing to this area. Inshallah.
Absolutely.
Inshallah.
Absolutely. There's a proof of concept there for us.
I cannot say the name just because it's not official yet. The contract needs to be given to him. But once it's mentioned, I'll make it public who it is.
Alhamdulillah. Fantastic. So we're going to be speaking about the Divine Action Project. So before we get into it, why are we talking about this topic, and what is this topic exactly, Shoaib?
Why are we talking? Because you asked me to.
Actually, let me answer the first part. You answer the second part. So you answer what it is. I'll answer why we want to speak about it. So all of us are, well, not all of us, majority of the people on this channel that are watching us right now, most likely you're going to be a theist of some sort. So we believe in God. We believe God is the creator. And the perennial problem between science and religion has also always been about God's actions in the world. Is it that God violates the patterns of the world, the laws of nature, or is it a simple case of God created the world and left it like the deists say? Is it the case that God has set these laws, but then you have these particular occasions in which God intervenes, but that intervention doesn't violate the laws? So it's all this very interesting discussion, and fundamentally, this, I believe, Shoaib, is at the heart of the supposed problem between science and religion. Why certain people say religious people cannot be great scientists, or religious society cannot contribute to the flourishment of science, is because they believe in a particular metaphysical perspective which interferes with the function of science. So that's what it's really about. We're going to get into the thick of what is this particular project, the special Divine Action Project. And before we get into this, I think what I want you to do in your words is explain what I explained, maybe in a bit more of a from a different perspective, because I know you're very interested in this topic yourself.
Yeah. So let me just kind of do some stage setting for the people who don't know the field too well. So the field of science and religion kind of started formalizing in the 1960s, right? Prior to then, we had several ideas that are floating around. The two big ones that really kind of initiated the field of science and religion was something called the conflict thesis, which was advanced by John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White. So they wrote two books around in the 1880s and the 1890s, and they advanced that certain versions of Christianity were at odds with science, And in fact, John William Draper, he actually even praises the Muhammadans, Muslims, in his book, right? And interestingly, his works were translated. I just found this quite recently into Arabic. And so there's interesting scholarship going on right now to see how that idea kind of migrated into the Muslim world. Anyways, so that was one thesis. There was another thing that kind of kicked off in the 1920s known as logical positivism. This is the idea, in very simple terms, we don't need to go into the details, that anything, basically a statement is either is meaningful only if it's like a tautology, right? Something that is, all the terms are clearly evident, or something that can be expressed scientifically, that has scientific backing. Anything else is meaningless. So if you say like emotions, God, metaphysics, these are meaningless terms. And as a result of that, there was a lot of pressure on religious folks back then to kind of respond to this. And I think against this context, and this is me simplifying a big history, we began to see the emergence of science and religion as a discipline in its own right in 1960s. The person who started the discipline is known as Ian Barber. He just passed away quite recently. And he wrote what is, you can refer to as the first textbook, so to speak. It's still a relevant book that we use today. So if, for example, you do science and religion in, university as a course, it is inevitable that you will start with Ian Barber. He kind of shaped the initial footings of the discussion. Now, science and religion, when it initiated in the 1960s, you begin to see now development of positions. The first journal, Zygon, so Zygon is the world's leading journal of science and religion. That started in the 1960s. Departments start opening up, positions start opening up, right? Now, the first phase, so science and religion has gone through 3 phases. We're in the 3rd phase right now. The first phase was from the 1960s to the 1980s. And the predominant focus in this time was the discussion of how do you relate science and religion? And this is working with the previous context in mind. Is it conflict? Is that really the main thing between science and religion? Ian Barber was the one who kind of opened the conversation. No, there are other ways of thinking about this. There's conflict, there's integration, there's dialogue, and what have you, right? And so, of course, he created that initial taxonomy, and then people critiqued it, and people developed it on and on and on. From the 1980s until the early 2000s, we then see something known as the Divine Action Project. This is what you're interested in, and this is what this whole conversation is about. Now, the Divine Action Project is super interesting, both theologically and historically, right? I'm interested in the theology. So fundamentally, the main assumptions, so remember, this is a big group, so not everyone will share this sketch that I'm about to share with you. But the Divine Action Project was essentially a discussion about how can we maintain that God is active in the world, that he influences the world, while at the same time maintaining the status of science discoveries, right? So we know that science discovers laws of nature. But how do we kind of put these two together? We want to be scientific. We don't want to jeopardize the scientific enterprise. But we also believe that God, influences the world. He does miracles, and et cetera, et cetera. So then how do you kind of square that circle? That's what this project was all about. And there were a couple of theories. I'm not going to go into detail now because I think that's what's going to advance soon. But there are a couple of theories that became very interesting avenues for this project to flourish. These include things like evolution, neuroscience, quantum mechanics, right? Chaos theory. All of these became, because these were new scientific theories, right, that were bubbling up in the day. And these became, hot discussions in that could there be avenues or areas in which we can still preserve the science, but we can find rooms for God to influence the world without compromising the science. That seems to be the main assumption. And one other presumption behind this group is that they were averse to miracles, in the sense that things that violated laws of nature, they were averse to that, generally speaking, which is why they wanted to see if they could have scientific renditions. Could we explain, for example, Moses splitting the seas through science? Could we explain other aspects through science? So that was the general motivation of this project. And there were a lot of key people in this area, a lot of key people. And so they published actually these 7 books that became like the staple reference for high quality scholarship of science religion. I have them somewhere here. But yeah, so these were the texts. And when I read them, you can tell that this is quite interesting from an Islamic angle. But I'll stop there. But that's the summary of the Divine Action Project.
Yeah. I think what would be helpful is to map out the landscape. So we could point out, say, Keith Ward's perspective on this. The other guy who I was watching today, the video that I discussed with you. So all the different perspectives, because one thing which I found interesting, your host on, your guest on Academic Access, the one who wrote about Divine Action Project and the Laws of Nature, he found the field, some people in the field had restricted God. So then he tried to open up the, if you like, the project so that there's more degrees of freedom. So maybe if you mention the different camps, the different perspectives, the different narratives that people have within the Divine Action Project.
Yeah. So within the Divine Action Project, the main thesis is like I said earlier, that how can you preserve science and at the same time preserve belief that God interferes or influences the world. And that interview with Jeff was kind of an exposure to that. So he has this book called Divine Action, which is open access. You can find on Routledge, you can download it. It's a beautiful book. And in that project, they came up with some ideas that were very, very important, right? So one conversation in that discussion is, what is the status of laws of nature? What do we mean by that, right? So when we discover laws and we give them scientific renditions, what is the science doing? Is it describing what's out there, or is it prescribing what's out there, right? So that's one conversation. So describing, all the scientific theory is telling us is what the state of affairs is out there. Prescribing means this is how actually things are. This is the way the world actually works. So that's one conversation. The other conversation is...
Could you elaborate on that a little bit? So we have a description and a description. It sounded kind of similar. Could you maybe give an example to elucidate the point?
Yeah. Okay. So a descriptive. This is a basic distinction that, inshallah, when you publish papers, inshallah. But this is something that will happen all the time. You can either have a prescriptive approach, how things ought to be or how things are, versus how things are being described, right? So let's say, for example, I do certain experiments and I describe what those experiments are. I'm just saying what I'm observing. So that's a descriptive account. A prescriptive account is when you say that this is how things will be. That's how things are. So when for example, that's true. That's what it is, right? So when I say, for example, have the theory for quantum mechanics, right? Schrodinger's equation. Does that describe the world, as in like that's what it's kind of indicating, or does that prescribe what's happening out there? Is that showing you what is true at all times and place, right? So that's one conversation, and this is important. This is important because in the Divine Action Project, to understand what science is revealing makes a big impact on how you see God interfering with the world. If all that science does is just describing, that if there are exceptions to science, science can't tell you, right? If a miracle occurred, science is invisible to that, right? But if you're saying this is how it actually occurs, this is what reality is actually like, so you have a stronger now commitment of what's out there, then miracles become a problem in this conversation. All right? Now, the other discussion, and I'm not going to use the fancy words, I'm just going to describe what these positions are. The other conversation is, are there any potential avenues within these scientific discoveries which God can instrumentalize so that, miracles that are very rare occur? And this is where things like indeterministic theories like quantum mechanics and evolution become important. Now, let me explain what I mean by that, because I use some big words there, right? So determinism and indeterminism are two key words that are important to this. Determinism is a well-known idea in philosophy of science, right? Where the universe is just like clockwork, right? So A causes B causes C. So if you know all the preceding steps, you'll know what's coming afterwards. So it's like a domino stack, right? So the first domino has a second domino, the third domino, and on and on and on. So it's clearly like there's a fixed path here. Indeterminism, however, does not say that the world is fixed. It's not linear. In each point, there are potentially different options. For example, evolution is a theory, right? Where if you rewind the clock, according to some, you may get very different species coming out of it, right? Everything is completely non-determinable. There is no deterministic aspect to it. Things are not going to come out as you predict them. That's why in indeterministic theories, we talk about probabilities and possibilities, not what actually will occur. From the 17th century to the 19th century, the whole world was understood through the lens of Newtonian physics, which is the idea that if I know the initial speed, I know the initial angle, I can calculate exactly how the ball works. Remember, Sabur, we studied in what's it called? In A-level physics, right? F is equal to ma, mass times acceleration, right? So that is basic standard Newtonian physics, completely linear. But in the early part of the 20th century, we see a couple of theories that come out that question the determinism of the universe. These include quantum mechanics, where electrons pop in and out of existence. These include things like evolution, which is why these two theories became very interesting points of conversation in the Divine Action Project. Why and how? Well, take quantum mechanics as an example, right? In quantum mechanics, an electron, if it's in a state called a wave function. Now, physicists have they've disagreed on what the wave function is. But one expression is that an electron can be in all these positions simultaneously, so to speak. Yeah. So electron could be here, 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 here. And so there is a non-zero probability that electron can be in multiple places or in all these places, which we can't figure out. Only when you see inside, you collapse the wave function, can you see where the electron is. So all these possibilities collapse. That's where Schrodinger's idea about, Schrodinger's cat come into play. That's how he expressed quantum mechanics. That if you have a cat, you put it in a box and you plug in a poisonous gas into the box, the cat is possibly both alive and dead, possibly. And only when you open the box do you collapse all the possibilities and render one. The same thing goes in quantum mechanics, right? So quantum mechanics, now how does it relate to the Divine Action Project? Well, a lot of these people want to say, can we somehow still believe that God interferes the world, but through scientific lens? And so this is where they saw that quantum mechanics perhaps offers these opportunities in God can put electrons in all these very low probable spaces to allow miracles to occur. So for example, take the event of Musa alayhi salam, the sea splitting up, right? Perhaps through quantum mechanics, he chose all the right properties for the electrons because seas don't naturally separate. It doesn't happen. Never happens at all, right? But in quantum mechanics, every possibility is imaginable, so to speak. Every possibility is imaginable. There's a non-zero aspect to it. And so perhaps God instrumentalized quantum mechanics to be able to achieve those miracles. Now, why is this interesting and, attractive? Precisely because of the fact that it allows you to believe God influences the world. God is active in the world. And at the same time, you're preserving science. This is the key thing. This is the key thing. So these are the two main conversation points that I would say you can kind of talk about when it comes to Divine Action Project. Or to you.
Yeah, that's a very good sort of overview of the field. Now, obviously, we as Muslims, we believe in miracles, but the point of having this discussion is just to update the audience in terms of what is the contemporary discussion here, because science and religion has moved on from the very simplistic conflict thesis that existed in the early part of the 20th century. And there are really interesting conversations happening when it comes to this. I just wanted to add something about epistemic and ontological randomness. So what role does that play in terms of how the divine action theorists think about, you know, areas where they could try and explain certain phenomena?
Right. So the idea of chance is pretty much what indeterminism is all about. That are there like chance scenarios which allows God to influence outcomes, right? That's the key thing. That was the main driving aspect. That's what indeterminism really is about. So the conversation that you're referring to is expanding and opening up what we mean by chance. And this is where a lot of people kind of muck up, I believe, right? Because the moment you say chance, people kind of lose it. Say, are you saying that Allah doesn't know what he's doing? That's the first thing that people think about, right? However, there are four conceptions of chance, philosophically differentiated conceptions of chance. And it's important to mark out which one we're talking about, right? So broadly speaking, you have something called epistemic chance and ontological. Let's focus on epistemic. Epistemic chance is simply determined based on what we can know from our vantage point, right? And within epistemic chance, there are two variations: uncertain, unknowable. Uncertain and unknowable, right? So what do I mean by uncertain chance? Take a coin toss, right? A coin toss. Now we know it can only land on one of two sides, heads or tails. There's no doubt about that, right? However, on a specific toss, when I toss a coin, can I for sure say which side it's going to land on? No, it's just not going to happen, right? We can guess, but we will never actually fully know. Only and unless I have all the information, which no one has. No one has infinite information. All the air particles, the weight of the mass, and how it's going to like friction and all of that. No one's going to have that, right? That's the reason why. That's the reason why we cannot say 100% certainty which side it's going to land on. That's uncertain. That's and the uncertain version of epistemic chance. The second aspect is a stronger version of epistemic, which is unknowable. We just do not know. We are not in the vantage point to know, right? So, for example, one common example used to explain unknowable chance is half-life, right? Half-life is a concept where if you have a certain amount of something over a period of time, half of its activity or half of its mass or volume decreases. It's gone. Yeah. And so how does that occur is based on these unknowable processes. For example, half-life in radioactivity. We know that after a certain point, after a certain time, all radioactive substances lose half of their activity. That's why you have this like curve that goes down, right? It slopes off. But exactly what causes that is unknowable. To make it clear, because some people may not know that, think of, for example, a place in which humans today can never access the past. So, for example, Sabur, do you believe in Julius Caesar? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, do you know? Can any human ever know what piece of clothing he was wearing on the second last day before his death?
Nope.
No, right? It's unknowable. We are not in the epistemic positionality to know that. So it's completely out of our purview. It's unknowable. So the difference between uncertain is that we associate probabilities. We theoretically could map it out. Unknowable is we just do not know categorically, right? So these are the two epistemic chances. Is that clear before I move on to the ontological one? Yeah. Okay. Now, ontological chance has two parts as well. One weak and one soft. One weak and strong, sorry, right? In the weaker version of ontological chance, all this means is that potentially there are physical gaps in nature, right? There are physical gaps in nature. So that when we study them, what we think are like, indeterminacies are simply just gaps in nature. So for example, not that this is the case, I'm just using it as a pure example. Quantum mechanics, electrons popping in and out of existence. There's no preceding physical cause. Perhaps these are just popping in and out of existence. That's the way God created, for all we know. For all we know, right? And that's why it looks chancy to us. It looks random to us. Perhaps. Yeah. This is the weaker version of ontological chance. The stronger version of ontological chance, which is different to the first one, is that there is no physical cause and there is no metaphysical cause. Now, this is important to highlight. Why? Because if you believe that there is no metaphysical cause as well, then that means chance is now literally an agent, it's an actor. It has its complete independence. Now, do you want me to link this to the Islamic standpoint to see how these map out from an Islamic stance?
Before we do that, let's just speak about how this this distinction impacts the Divine Action Project in general.
Right, yeah. So these four things become very important with respect to how you interpret chance, and therefore how you interpret all these indeterministic theories like evolution and quantum mechanics and chaos theory, right?
Yes.
So if you believe that chance is epistemic, no problem. That just means it's boiled based on our ability to map out the world. No problem, right? But if you believe chance is ontological, then this has a significant impact with respect to laws of nature. Are they physically gappy, right? Do they have any gaps in them in reality? Or is it to do with what we can know? And what the Divine Action Project, what they would like to believe is they're saying it's not just epistemic, it's actually ontological. They would prefer this to be the case so that you can use these gaps in nature, these plugs in nature, to show that God uses these gaps to influence the outcomes. That's where that comes in. And usually it falls down to either the ontological weak chance or the ontological strong chance. So let me give you one example, right? John Polkinghorne. John Polkinghorne is a very famous physicist. He then became an Anglican priest, right? So he believes the following. He says that because God loves creation, I mean, remember he's talking from a Christian standpoint, right? Because God loves his creation, God limits his knowledge and power. This is called the kenotic model, right? He limits his knowledge and power so that the creation has independence and autonomy. And this way, creation can grow on its own. In other words, that chance can become a factor of its own right. Yes. Randomness can become a playing agent on its own right because it doesn't have any preceding physical causes, and nor is God, influencing that. So he believes in the strong interpretation of ontological chance. And you can see now, maybe from an Islamic standpoint, when you look at all this, like, oh, what's happening here?
Now, this is a perfect segue to explain why Muslims should be involved in academia. Because what we could do from our perspective is say, well, this is a red line. We can't say God doesn't know stuff. What's the other theoretical possibilities? Okay, from a Ghazalian point of view, from a Taymiyan point of view, what's going to happen? And obviously, they're not going to accept the idea that God has limited his knowledge of the world. So one of the things I was reading with Keith Ward's, he's also got a book on the Divine Action Project, is I've forgotten the exact wording. I read it a few hours ago. But again, there was this type of Islamically unacceptable theological statement that he made about the divine. So this is why I think Muslims need to understand what the Divine Project is, understand what are the different areas and how they intersect with different theories, because then we could give our card to the deck and say, well, okay, you've got all these different ideas. How about this? And you did this in chapter 6, I believe, of your book, right?
Yeah. So in my book on Islam and evolution, I knew that I had to map out what the Divine Action Project really is. And that's because most of the science or religion conversations are influenced a lot by that, right? So remember I said earlier that, science and religion went through 3 phases. So the first stage was about methodology. How do you relate science, religion? The third was to do with the second was to do with divine action. And the third, which is the phase that we're in now, is called science-engaged theology. We don't need to worry about that. But a lot of these conversations in this third phase have been influenced by the Divine Action Project, also known as DAP, DAP. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to clearly map out what the Divine Action Project is so that Muslims can understand what is and isn't problematic here, right? So for example, epistemic chance. We don't have a problem with epistemic chance. Absolutely no problem, right? We know that we do not have full access. When we toss a coin, right, we know that we will never know exactly on which side it will land on. We know that, no problem. Absolutely no problem whatsoever, right? So from our point of view, epistemic chance is not an issue. Now, ontological, this is where the distinction between weak and strong come into play. Can Allah create a world in which there are physical gaps in nature such that it looks chance to us? Allah, of course, can do that. No problem from our vantage point. Absolutely no problem. But can we accept a world where Allah limits himself or he doesn't know what's going on in reality? No. This kind of strong ontological is kufr. It's no one believes in that. This is clearly problematic. And it actually, yeah, go ahead.
No, Karen, make your point first.
This same idea that something being outside of God's power and knowledge is something that falls back into the criticisms that people had with the Mu'tazilis, right?
There you go. Yeah.
The Mu'tazilis believed that they created their own action. Humans create their own action. Not only did they choose, they also create their own action. Why did they state this? Because they wanted to avoid attributing evil to Allah. That's what they wanted to do, right? So they said human beings create their own action. This is the reason why, right? Now, if you do that, the problem is you have now created a power outside the power of God. That's the problem. This is the same equivalent here, exactly the same equivalent, right? And so that's why it's important to highlight the DAP and the dangers it can have.
See, this is exactly why this topic is so important, and the work that you're doing is so important, because I just remember now that's exactly what Keith Ward was doing in his book. He was arguing how he wanted to show how God is free of evil that happens in the world. So God intervenes at certain points, but other points he can't intervene, right? Yeah. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but he says he can't intervene. And so what happens is when you get a young, impressionable Muslim who is trying to think, okay, how do we reconcile scientific discoveries and laws and non-interventionism so that we can show that Islam is a coherent philosophy which allows science to flourish? Well, you've got these answers which are theologically problematic from an Islamic perspective, but they're the only answers on the deck. They're the only cards available. And the importance of the work that you're doing, and in the book Islam and Evolution, is that you're showing, well, here are things keeping DAP in mind, and here are theologically sound Islamic things that we can give an answer for. So you can keep the science, you can keep the scientific discoveries, you can keep the laws of nature without violation, and here is a sound theology. That, I think, Shoaib, is the mother of the point. That's what you're trying to do. That's what we are trying to do, because ultimately this goes back to your initial point about people apostating. If there's only two choices, which is, the first choice is, let me try and reconcile science and religion. The only ways it can be done is if you undermine religion, right, in terms of our theological stances, or leave the religion. There's this false dichotomy. But here you are saying, actually, no, here's the solution. So I hope that's been made clear that for everybody that's watching, this is exactly why Muslims need to be engaged in these academic discussions.
100%. I agree with that. I think that one of the things that we don't realize is that a lot of this material is influencing and being read by Muslim scholars. You know, whether they're trained in Aqidah or not, that's a different conversation. But it does influence and trickle down to the masses, particularly because when Arabic is not the lingua franca. The lingua franca of the world is English, and most of our kids will experience these conversations. They will face these in high schools. They will face this on YouTube, which is like the biggest sensation right now. All of this is going to trickle down at some point, and it's important to kind of then write or have some kind of alternatives that gives some Islamic representation to these. Which again, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have that series on Islam and science. So to kind of map all of these out, to give proper acknowledgement to the sciences, to these ideas, but also how Islam might contribute to discussions, right? So for example, organ transplantation, right? How does this look from an Islamic angle? There was a big hoo-ha in Netherlands a couple of months ago, which Mansour, he's the one who was contracted for this book on organ transplantation for my series. So he mentioned to me that in Netherlands, there was a big hoo-ha about a politician. He said that Muslims are taking our organs, but they're not giving them back. In other words, Muslims have no problem taking organs of non-Muslims, but then when we want their organs, they say no. So what exactly is the Islamic discussion on this issue, right? What are the outer limits? What are the full, jurisprudential, fiqh aspects of these things? He maps it all out. He gives people all these options. So this is the kind of stuff that I think needs to happen more and more of.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Shoaib, if you can map out the Islamic camps when it comes to the discussion about epistemic and ontological randomness.
Right. Yeah. So when it comes to the four aspects of randomness that I discussed earlier, right? So you got weak epistemic chance, strong epistemic chance, weak ontological chance, and strong ontological chance. So from an Islamic standpoint, right, epistemic chance has never been an issue. Absolutely
Yes,
not an issue whatsoever. It's just not a concern,
anybody,
right?
for anybody, not just Muslims.
Yeah, not Muslim, right? In the ontological section, however, we need to be careful. Can Allah create a world with their physical gaps? No problem whatsoever. Absolutely no issue. So we have no problem with weak ontological chance. That is absolutely no problem. Perhaps we may hit a limit in which there is no preceding physical cause. That things just happen and
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
What you mean by gaps is
So what I
something
mean,
which is
so let's say, so we usually believe A causes B, causes C, causes D, right? Now, all of this chain is caused by Allah, A, B, C, D. Yes? However, can Allah create a chain where you have A space C, where there is no space for B? Yes, he could if he
right.
wanted to.
Okay,
He could
so
create
I was trying to find a way of putting it, and it's just sometimes good to come up with examples. Imagine if that particular sequence, the laws of nature switch has been switched off.
Yeah.
That's another way of doing it. It's just a little gap in which those laws are switched off. Yeah.
Is that possible? Of course that's possible. So weak ontological chance is also not a problem.
Yeah.
Where things get really problematic is strong ontological chance, where chance becomes some kind of an agent, like an entity that can influence the world, right? And so, and it also entails like God doesn't know what he's doing, or God doesn't know what he's controlling. That is, in any school, complete kufr and shirk. You cannot accept that. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely, Shoaib. I've heard myself, and we know of this, sadly, in the Muslim world, Muslim liberals, they will praise the Mu'tazilites, right? And this was one of their biggest issues, right? I mean, when we talk about hyper-rationalization, I think that's the wrong term. It's not hyper-rationalization, because you're rationalizing. Your book, Islam and Science, Chapter 6, Divine Action Project, and the Islamic perspective on it, that's a rationalization. The problem is when one group, such as this, the Mu'tazilites, they believed in this strong ontological randomness, then they become the monopolizing representatives of what supposedly the rationalization of those concepts, right? And that's why we need to be in those discussions.
Yep, I 100% agree. I think that I think Hamza said, right? Hamza source, he had this one statement that I really like. If you're not giving da'wah is being done to you. So so this is where it comes down to, right? So if you are not owning the landscape will own you. So you've got to make sure that you have a full the ability and the capability to address these concerns according to the landscape that you're dealing with. In academia, this is the popular mindset. It's not, no, hang on. It's a popular mindset. It's not the only one. There's even pushback against it, even by Christians, saying, hang on. This looks too much like scientism now. We're not giving so much precedence to the science. What about God? Could God not, if he wanted to change the laws of nature? Of course he could. This is classical theology. So we have now even classical scholars. We're talking about people who follow Catholic theology like Aquinas and Augustine, right? So they are pushing back against this. It's not just the Islamic voice. It's also now Christian voices that are coming up. So, and this is where I find a lot of denominators that that I can share with other people who also have issues with the Divine Action Project. So don't believe that this is the only position out there. The Divine Action Project was a project that was very, very influential across 2 decades. But people have had a mixed reception now in this new phase that we're in, post-2000. Some people being for it, some people being against it, some people being critical with some aspects of it. And so I think that's why we also need to do the same thing from the Islamic stance. And I gave it from one angle. I hope that other people can look at it from other angles as well.
Yeah. And remember, what is the objective of getting involved in these discussions about the Divine Action Project and the Islamic perspective? It's simply to refute the idea that you cannot do science as a theist, or theistic societies have this perspective which is going to be corrosive to the laws of nature and scientific discovery, because there's constant interventions and miracles happening all the time, right?
Yeah.
So we have to remember the objective is not to give science precedent over theology. That may be someone else's perspective when they're getting involved in Divine Action Project, but certainly not yours.
Yeah. So I think that, and this is just me being frank, I tell all my students, literally just before this session, I was in a class on Islam and new atheism, right? Oh, sorry, atheism, and we were talking about the problem evil, and people automatically, all the students were able to see how your theology significantly impacts these conversations, right? So we looked at, the Mu'tazili response, the Ash'ari response, and on and on, and all the different camps, right? And so they were able to appreciate that your theological camp affects how you view these things. Science and religion is no different. Science and religion is no different. So this is why I encourage all my students and anyone else who's watching this is study creed. Aqeedah is very, very important, particularly in today's time and day, where the challenges of science, the challenge of philosophy are sharper and perhaps more subtle than they were before. And it's why it's important to engage with the Torah, the Islamic tradition. Now, of course, people will have various camps that they come from, but I believe that it's important to acknowledge that needs to be engaged to address these problems today. It needs to be engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's carry on with, you were going over the different perspectives from the Islamic side. Obviously, we don't accept strong ontological randomness, and weak we can. And now you use the in chapter 6, you went over the Ghazalian or the Asharite sort of perspective on that. Could you go over that?
Yeah. So, and this narrative is not just specifically Ash'ari. It's for all three schools. There's a lot of overlap across all three schools, right? So all the Sunni madhabs, right? And I speak as a Sunni because that's my background. I'm a Sunni Muslim, right? So all three madhabs believe Allah created the world, number one. All three madhabs believe that Allah created the world with regularities, right? That we refer to as Sunnatullah, right? Or Adawatullah, right? And it is those regularities that we use to study the world, right? That's what we use. That's the basis of science. That's the theological footprint of science, right? So if there were no regularities, we would not be able to derive laws, right? And that's why theology is important, because science just takes, okay, there are laws we're studying, but it doesn't explain where the laws come from. That's where theology and philosophy become important. Hence, my focus on Aqeedah. Go back to Aqeedah. It's important. Once I studied Aqeedah, a lot of these issues just kind of dissolved for me. So now all three schools believe God created the world. God created laws of nature. God can also create miracles, right? He can create things that do not follow the rule. That's why we have no problem. All three Sunni schools have no problem believing the idea that Musa alayhi salam, the sea split. There could be no scientific explanation for that. We have no problem. Zero problem with that, right? The fact that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if you pointed a finger at the moon, it split and it went back again. No problem again. From our point of view, no problem. We don't have to believe that there's a scientific explanation for these events. This has not been a concern for us. The problem is now that when we start using science as the rubric for how God intervenes, this is now, and this is where the discussion of scientism, which we've talked about several times before, right? And this is a more creeping version of scientism because it's religious in nature. Hence why there's a category called religious scientism. And Muslims are not, this is not the first time we've encountered this. The whole scientific miracles in the Quran, that was a form of religious scientism where we wanted to. Yeah, so go ahead.
Going back to Sir Sayyid, his ideas.
Yeah. This has a historical precedent, right? Where we should kind of put either use science as our measuring stick or try to conform as much as we can to science. That is problematic, right? Because theologically, we're not required to do that, right? Theology has its own matrix, has its own rubric. of which there's a small part that belongs to science, of which of that's it. But to use science to judge theology, that's problematic. That is severely problematic. And I think, and unfortunately, because of the way our education systems are, right? I mentioned when we had the discussion in London, right, and on your channel, that even in an Islamic context, I was in a school with Muslims around, but all of us were thinking like that it's either God or science, right? It's either laws of nature or miracles. We don't know how to square the two. And it's for this reason, theology helps with that. If you believe that God created the world and God created laws of nature, God can also violate or change those laws of nature if he wanted to. And I think that's why theology helps you ground your theology. That's your worldview. And that's why I think it's always it's known as usul ad-din. It's the foundations of your religion. It's the basis of your religion. If you don't know that, you're pretty much like an open leaf. Wherever the wind blows, you blow.
Exactly. And I think this is a good segue to discuss that this entry into academia from a theological perspective, where your Aqidah is strong, then you will not come up with these sort of things from an Islamic perspective that Keith Ward is saying or others are saying, about things which are theologically very problematic. I think the problem I see, and I don't know whether I'm generalizing, but it could be that Muslims first go into academia, they're not trained, and then they go back a few steps and they try and get theologically up to speed, but by then they've already been infused with these scientific ideas.
Yeah, so I think scientism, comes in all shapes and forms and sizes, right? If there are people who go into academia, I think people have to recognize that you will be in a culture where, it's not always the case. It depends from one professor to another. I don't want to generalize across the board, right? Some professors are very neutral. They don't want to influence your worldview. They just want to teach their subject matter. There are professors like that. Other professors are very aggressive. They're in-your-face atheists, right? Other professors are very sympathetic to whatever religion you espouse. They may be agnostic, but they don't want to influence what you're doing, right? So I think that that needs to be first cleared off. However, it needs to be recognized that in these institutions, these are secular institutions, so to speak. Universities is not where you will go to get guidance for your religion, right? Even Islamic studies programs, you'll be shocked at some of the things that you'll hear in the classroom. People will be talking about gender issues. People will be talking about, the science of religion conversations. And their job in the university is not necessarily to help you become a Muslim. The job in the university is to help you think and to just, give you all the different opinions without telling you which one is correct, which is fine. That's the university position. But if you go into that environment, then know that if you do not have a sound theological backbone, it is very likely that you may become confused at the end of that line. That's the concern here. I remember from my own experience. So in engineering, our focus is just literally production, right? That's how we were trained. To such an extent that I remember like miracles and it became a problem for me. Like, how do I square miracles here? And only when I started studying theology seriously did all of this kind of fall into place so easily, so naturally. But if you don't have that, man, you get locked in this conundrum. You really get locked in this conundrum. In this course that I taught recently, right?
Yeah.
Once we went over the contingency argument and all these discussions about science and religion, then people were able to see how you can now believe both in miracles and science.
Yeah.
That's when they began to see that. In the absence of that, they didn't know how to square it.
Yeah. I'm glad you said theological backbone, because backbone doesn't mean knowledge. It also means the strength to take a stand, because you could easily, Shoaib, go into the Divine Action Project and say, this is a few years ago, look at all the different ideas, and you could just latch on to one of the ideas of, say, like the sort of thing Keith Ward was saying, and just put some Islamic coloring on it. But you have to have the ability to have the backbone to say, that's wrong. Here's the Islamic paradigm I need to defend. And do you know what? I can't see how I can defend it. I'm going to have to spend a lot of brain juice on this now. That's what people don't want to do. I think, Shoaib, that's one of our biggest problems. We don't think about, okay, how can I, like you said, how can I square this? How can I keep to this Islamic paradigm and try and show that we can not interfere with the laws of nature, and we can stick to an understanding in a way that's theologically sound. And it's just a matter of effort. It takes time. I mean, what we find amongst the different Christian groups and Jewish groups is they will have their stances, which are non-negotiable, and then they will go and fight and try until they have something that they can present.
Yeah. I think that so one thing needs to be made clear, right? When we talk about the Divine Action Project, remember, most of the people in the field of science and religion are Christians. So they'll naturally be talking with their presumptions in mind, which is fine. That's great for them, right? And even them, they have their internal disagreements. Like, is this really the best way to go forward? So now we're seeing a counter reaction to this movement, right? But we also need to be clear that Muslims do not share some theological axioms with Christians. What happens is because of this, the materials that are out there, particularly available in English, it becomes very easy to influence an entire generation of people because that's now the main reference. And unless we have, more production, be it on the social media front, the academic front, we will constantly see people being deluded, might be the wrong word here, but influenced, right? Wrongly influenced by things that may not be representative of the Islamic tradition. And that's the only thing that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to just kind of show, these are some contemporary questions. It's not just Islam and science. There are many things in philosophy, right? A lot of interesting developments have come up that I think will require some kind of responses from the Islamic angle. So, for example, dialetheism, that's another one where contradictions are true, for example, right? So that's an interesting area where I think Muslim philosophers will need to get into. But what's another worry, another concern that I have is that in academia, if you come across apologetically, you will not be treated seriously, which is why there is a learning curve to be had here, where when you engage, it's not just you're writing just to kind of defend your faith, but you're also being academically robust to show why these things are problematic. So it's really, I think, a huge learning curve, because, when I first started publishing in this area, I took one chapter, interestingly, chapter 6, the one you referenced. I submitted that as is to a journal. The feedback that I got is that it's apologetic. That was the feedback that I got. So that was with one journal, right? And I think there was a lot of gatekeeping involved, because I think that some people did not want to get, did not want traditional voices to become mainstream in academia. But alhamdulillah, through the book, I think it was taken very seriously. And because of its academic tone and merit, it was also awarded a few things, right? So that's the reason why I think it's not necessarily always about defending. It's fine. That's what you want to do as your personal objective. But in academia, it has to be robust, which comes down to what you said: effort and scholarship. Those two things are the driving forces. You need to have that effort. You need to have that will, that passion to be able to do things robustly.
Yeah, I mean, Imam Ghazali didn't write Incoherence of the Philosophers in a night. It took a long time. Yeah. And I think one of the things which we generally don't do is we don't like to do things which are difficult. We don't like to do things that don't have easy answers. We don't like to do things which are controversial, and we don't like to do things in which we have to challenge the status quo. But these are the ingredients that are needed to be able to actually come forward and say, here is an Islamic perspective. Because you either go big or go home. And it is a very high standard. And the other thing which is why I'm really interested in the work that you're doing, and we spoke about this a few years ago, it's about future-proofing the dawah, right? So 20 years from now, right, somebody can go back and say, okay, we're dealing with this particular issue. What did this person do? Okay, I can reference this paper. I can work on something. And society is getting more and more intelligent over time, right? It doesn't sound like it with, TikTok and all these things, but actually people are. Muslims are getting really, they're making inroads into academia. And these simplistic answers that were given, say, 20, 30 years ago, they simply don't work. We have to really, up the game. So we're coming to the hour mark. It's been I know you did a long live stream before this, so did I. But in terms of the Divine Action Project, what are some future projects that you would like to see between the intersection of, say, Islam and adab?
Right. So one of the things that I'm personally working on, this book inshallah should be out this year, is as I mentioned earlier, within our history, I'm not talking about theological, within our history, we have various individuals. We have people like Ibn Sina, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Arabi, Razi, and these guys are brilliant luminaries in their own right, but they also have differences between them. Yeah. And so one of the things to kind of allude to what you were saying is to up the game. We have a book coming out called Seven Classical Perspectives on Islam Science, where we take each of these interlocutors and we give their framework so that people can look through their framework to do Islam and science. So that the hard work is done for them. The hard work this is a team of 13 people. So for example, the Ibn Taymiyyah chapter is written by Jamie Turner and Carl Sharif al-Tubgi, right? Two brilliant scholars in Ibn Taymiyyah, mashallah, right? And so each of these chapters has the same subsections and heading. So you can even do a comparison and contrast across the different thinkers, right? And this book, I hope, will kind of lay the foundation for further investigations and ideas. So because when we look at the Divine Action Project, it is important to realize that there are certain metaphysical, theological presumptions that motivate this project. To see whether this is Islamically friendly or not, you need to see what the Islamic tradition says. And that's why we focus on these 7 individuals. And then that can become an important resource. What I want to see in the future is further extending the conversations. So I would like to see, for example, further representation of Ibn Taymiyyah, right? I want to see that on, for example, AI. What is Ibn Taymiyyah's discussions on things like quantum mechanics or chaos theory? Those are the kinds of works that I'd like to see. And hopefully, inshallah, many things down the line that I think going to become more and more incredible to discuss about. So for example, the hadith, remember the ChatGPT stuff? This has been the year of AI, right? And in February, there was this program called Hadith GPT. So Hadith GPT started dishing out fatwas, so somebody, it was an MSc project. They just put all the 6 hadith books in there, right? And people start using it as a fatwa base. So we might now see where AI potentially will compete or might ultimately even replace muftis. What do we say about that, right? So those conversations, I think, are going to be very important. How do you teach Islam and science? That's also another conversation. So my intention is hopefully that I've now provided an outlet where we can have academic production. And I'm just now and I'm teaching and trying to mentor people to do research in this area. That's what I'm doing as one individual. I think there needs to be more people in this area. And hopefully in the long run, the goal is to properly build an infrastructure, perhaps a department of Islam and science. Where and how, we'll see, inshallah. But that's my next goal right now. The next 10 years, there should be a university or some kind of department on Islam and science. And that's my next stage, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. That was a really insightful introduction, because it's a light introduction into the topic. So Shoaib, if people wanted to see what you're up to, what's the main social media place that they can find you?
So since we last spoke, I don't think I had Twitter. So I'm now active on Twitter thanks to your suggestion. So there are three places that you can find me. One, Facebook. That's my main area. I'm ancient, I know, compared to some. What is it, Gen Z? That's what they call the new people, Gen Z. Yeah. So Facebook is where I am. Twitter is where I am. I only post stuff. I literally don't engage with people on Twitter. I just literally just post stuff. So if you're expecting a response, please forgive me if I don't respond to you. And then the third one is academia. Academia is pretty much the place where all academics put up their publications. So all my work is up there. So if you want to read some stuff, that's where things are, inshallah.
Brilliant. Jazakallah khair for that, Shoaib. Until next time.